Sir Edwin Carrington, former Secretary General of CARICOM, Pro-Vice Chancellors and Campus Principals, Professor Denzel Williams and Professor Rosemary Bell Antwine, former Minister of Finance in the Government of Trinidad and Tobago, Winston Ducaran, Professor of Practice at the UWI St. Augustine, Dr. Terence Farrell, the editors, the editing team that has afforded us the opportunity to come together this afternoon in Jamaica, this evening in Trinidad. The editors, Professor Andrew Downs, Professor Emeritus Compton Bourne, Dr. Arnold McIntyre, and Dr. Rosalie O'Mealy. Ladies and gentlemen, tuned in for today's book launch. My name is Marlene Atz. I'm Dr. Marlene Atz from the Department of Economics at the UWI St. Augustine campus. And it is my pleasure to serve as the chair for this evening's book launch. And it's particularly a special honor for me because I recall that as a young economist, I was introduced to several regional economic giants, including Sir Alister, William Demas and Norman Girvan. And truth to be told, they, among others, were instrumental in shaping my interest in development economics and more so my interest in the development trajectory of the Caribbean. So I also respected how tirelessly these giants and others in the economics profession worked to shape our Caribbean region. Needless to say, many gains have been made, and the gains that we've made in the region are due in no small measure to the work of persons like Sir Alister McIntyre, whom we celebrate this evening with the launch of some of his selected papers and speeches. The first order of business is for me to convey apologies on behalf of the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Sir Hilary Beckles. Sir Hilary has been unavoidably called away to an emergency, so he's not able to join us this evening as he was scheduled on the program. But he sends his best wishes. He congratulates the editorial team for the work that they've done in putting together Sir Alister's speeches and papers, and he wishes us the best this evening. To start the formal part of the evening's proceedings, I wish to introduce Professor Rosemary Bell Antwine, my campus principal, to give some welcome remarks. By way of introduction, on August the 1st, 2022, Professor Antwine assumed leadership of the UWI St. Augustine campus as its Pro-Vice Chancellor and campus principal. Professor Antwine is an attorney by profession, specializing in labor law and offshore financial law. She's a Cambridge Fellow and an award-winning, internationally recognized author whose career embodies excellence in research combined with an outstanding record of transformational public service and leadership in the region and beyond. Professor Antwine has earned an international reputation as a leading scholar, a versatile international consultant, and a human rights and development activist. Her scholarship has been acknowledged not only for its quality and depth, but its diversity, creativity, humanity, and breadth. So without further ado, I invite Professor Rosemary Bell Antwine to give remarks on behalf of the St. Augustine campus.
Good afternoon, everyone. Master of Ceremonies. Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Professor Denzel Williams, Chair of the UWI Press Board of Directors, and Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal of our sister campus, Five Islands, Professor Compton Bourne, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the UWI, and former President of the Caribbean Development Bank, former Pro-Vice Chancellor and Campus Principal of the UWI St. Augustine campus, Dr. Edwin Carrington, former Secretary General of the Caribbean Community and African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, Mr. Winston Ducaran, Professor of Practice at the UWI St. Augustine campus, and former Trinidad and Tobago Minister of Foreign Affairs, and then he founded the Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean, located right here at the UWI St. Augustine, Dr. Terence Farrell, economic and legal practitioner, and colleagues, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, and welcome to this virtual book launch of Caribbean Trade, Integration and Development, Selected Papers and Speeches of Alister McIntyre, Volumes 1 and 2. Vice Chancellor Emeritus Sir Alister McIntyre was a committed Caribbean integrationist a celebrated academic, and an intellectual whose contribution over his career and lifetime was prodigious. We are fortunate to be able to continue to learn and be inspired by the body of work that he has left to us. The brilliant consciousness-raising piece by the late Calypsonian, the beloved Black Stalin, recipient of an honorary degree from the UWI St. Augustine campus, could have been speaking for and about Sir Alister when he sang, "One race, the Caribbean man, from the same place, the Caribbean man, that make the same trip, the Caribbean man, on the same ship, the Caribbean man." So we must push one common intention, is for a better life in the region, for we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean man, the Caribbean man. We couldn't have said it any better. Black Stalin talks about rapping to our peoples so that they understand the need and importance of Caribbean unity. In these volumes, Sir Alister continues to rap to us and for us. I thank UWI Press for sharing the ebooks, and while I'm aware that Dr. Farrell is on the agenda to provide a review, I have no hesitation in saying this much. The editors of his work have done a superb job in contextualizing his papers and speeches. These vary from the Caribbean experience of regional economic integration, international trading relations and negotiations, and the future of Caribbean trade and development. Future researchers and students will most assuredly thank you. Indeed, Sir Alister's vision of a university and a region that are firmly rooted in the Caribbean, but with a global outlook, appears to be increasingly playing out in our 21st century scenario. May I close by saying that it is fitting that the UWI Press should be hosting this event today, since it was due to Sir Alister's foresight that this university press even exists. I congratulate the team on how far you have come in 30 years, and I wish you continued success. Thank you once again to everyone who has joined us on this link for the launch of this body of work, while at the same time celebrating a life well lived in service to our entire region. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Antoine, for setting the stage. And I think it is quite appropriate. I think everyone who reflects on Black Stalin's Caribbean man will agree with you that he might have well be singing about Sir Alister, because he was indeed the consummate Caribbean man. As I indicated in my opening remarks, Vice Chancellor Sir Hilary Beckles is not able to join us this evening. He sends his best wishes. So in terms of the program, I will now invite Pro Vice Chancellor Professor Denzel Williams to bring greetings. Professor Denzel Williams, by way of introduction, he's a professor of international business, but he's also Pro Vice Chancellor for Industry and Academic Partnerships and Planning at the UWI. And he also wears the hat of being the principal of the UWI Five Islands campus. He's the former executive director of the Mona School of Business and Management at the UWI Mona campus. It is the largest business school in the Caribbean. Professor Williams serves on a number of boards as chairman, deputy chairman, and director, both in the public and private sectors in Jamaica and in the wider Caribbean. This evening, he has agreed to make a few remarks in his capacity as chairman of the UWI Press Board of Directors. Without further ado, Professor Williams, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, Dr. Atz. Let me also recognize Principal Bell Antoine, the various speakers for this evening, Professor Ducaron, Sir Edwin Carrington, Dr. Farrell and the authors, Professor Bourne, Professor Downs, and Dr. O'Mealy, and all Dr. McIntyre, and all the various persons who have contributed to this wonderful launch this evening. I too would like to join in the celebration and firstly thank our editors for bringing Sir Alister McIntyre's work to life again in another important volume that will actually make sure that the legacy and the work of a true Caribbean man lives on. This evening, I would like to say a few words on behalf of the UII Press in terms of their work in working with the authors to make sure that they bring this work, as I said, to life in a very substantial way. So I also want to thank the very hard-working staff of the UII Press who have been painstakingly working with the editors to ensure that this project has come to fruition. So I want to say a big thank you to those staff as well. Today, colleagues, friends, and members of the media and all those who have joined us this evening, I want to join in the celebration of the work of one of the foremost intellectual giants of our beloved Caribbean region, Sir Alister McIntyre. Sir Alister's work has a unique place in the discourse on Caribbean development, as it carves out a space for context-specific theorizing and empirical analyses based on one's circumstances, and not just a cut and paste and an unbridled neoliberal approach to development. Indeed, McIntyre, having a nuanced understanding of the historical and social evolution of a post-colonial and post-slavery society, recognized early in his career that the lived experience of the people must inform solutions to their developmental challenges. And so he went about carefully analyzing various aspects of their development and proffered solutions that are in keeping with their cultural and spiritual values in order to shape their own life's journey. So, with Caribbean trade integration and development, the editors of these volumes carefully and painstakingly selected works of Sir Alister McIntyre to reflect his intellectual contribution to development discourse, looking at issues such as decolonization and trade policy in the West Indies, towards a new international economic order, small countries in the world economy, governance and decentralization of the context of a regional university, among many other very interesting topics as well. Ladies and gentlemen, the speeches, academic papers, notes, all provide critical insights into the framing of a localized intellectual discourse on regional development, which can lay the foundation for the development and execution of homegrown policies and institutions to support our development efforts in the Caribbean. These volumes should be required reading for all those who are interested in Caribbean development that is anchored on context specificity, intellectual rigor, and clarity of thought. I would like to thank the editors for these volumes. They are timely and relevant today for the generation of scholars and policymakers and technocrats who are desirous of shaping a Caribbean nation that will participate in the new global economy powered by the fourth industrial revolution, so that when we rise up as a Caribbean, we can walk through the world on our feet and not on our knees. I want to say thank you again to the editors, and thanks to the McIntyre family for giving us Sir Alister McIntyre and his intellectual contribution to Caribbean development. Thank you.
Thank you, PVC Williams, for that thoughtful contribution this evening. Just moving along on the agenda, I would like to take a little page, and yes, as we know that Dr. Farrell is going to be providing us with a review of the volumes, but I just wanted to share the dedication as I introduce the next two speakers. Volume 1 of Sir Alister's papers and speeches includes a dedication to past and current generations of Caribbean economists who have devoted their attention to the intellectual foundations of Caribbean integration and development. Their ideas and activities have provided the groundwork for the development of institutions and policies upon which future generations of economists can build. That is a legacy that Sir Alister has left us in the region, and I think it is appropriate for us to have some insights of Sir Alister. So we are going to have reflections from two eminent Caribbean economists themselves, eminent Caribbean men themselves. So permit me to introduce both of them at this time. Winston Ducaran, currently Secretary General of the UN treaty-based Euclid University, and he was, up until 2022, a professor of practice at the Institute of International Relations at the UWI St. Augustine campus. He's the author of several books on the Caribbean, the most recent being The Caribbean on the Edge, Political Stress, Instability, Equality and Diplomacy, which he authored in 2022 at the University of Toronto Press. He's a former Minister of Finance in the government of Trinidad and Tobago. He was a visiting scholar at Harvard University, where he edited Choices and Change, Reflections on the Caribbean, essentially setting the stage as a prolific author and a practicing scholar in politics of economic development. The next person who will provide reflections on Sir Alister is none other than Sir Edwin Carrington, who is also an economist by profession, and he has had an eminent career. In 1976, he was appointed as Deputy Secretary General of the ACP Group of States, and in 1985, he became Secretary General of the ACP. He was the first Caribbean national to have held that position. In 1992, Sir Edwin became Secretary General of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, and when he left in 2010, he was the longest serving Secretary General of CARICOM, a career spanning 18 years as Secretary General. During his tenure at CARICOM, Sir Edwin oversaw the revision of the Treaty of Chaguaramas and the consequent transition of the community from a common market to a single market in 2006, and he pioneered the thinking process for a single economy. Upon leaving CARICOM in 2010, Sir Edwin returned to his home country, Trinidad and Tobago, and was appointed Trinidad and Tobago's ambassador to CARICOM from 2011 to 2015. So I asked Mr. Winston Ducaran to provide his reflections, and he will be followed by reflections from Sir Edwin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malinats. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I want to, first of all, thank Professor Compton Bourne for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts and my reflections of Ulster McIntyre on this very grand occasion. I, of course, recognize our Pro-Vice Chancellor, Denzel Williams, and our Principal of our St. Augustine campus, Dr. Antwine, and so many others of my colleagues who from time to time we have worked together at different stages in our respective careers. I first was introduced to Alister McIntyre in the very tiny office of Ramesh Ramsaran on the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies in 1971, when I first joined UE myself as a lecturer. At that time, he was a highly acclaimed economist of the day. And more than that, he was seen, as reflected here today by several who have already spoken, as a quintessential Caribbean man, and not without good reason. I remember the moment vividly. Here was a gentle, down-to-earth man with profound thoughts. And after he left us in that conversation, and subsequently, we always turned out to be in search of a new policy direction. As it happened, and as it turned out, he had a personality that quickly endeared himself to many, which give credits to Professor Ramphsal's recent words of him as perhaps the best known scholar, diplomat to have come out of the Caribbean region. I share our appreciation to the West Indies UWI Press and highly commend them for so quickly publishing these 2 volumes. The Institute of International Relations at St. Augustine in September 2019 held a symposium in tribute of Sir Alister McIntyre entitled The Caribbean on the Edge, Rising Above the Orthodoxy of Development Thinking. This indeed was a fitting title that reflects the intellectual quest of McIntyre, rising above orthodox paradigms of Caribbean development in his role as teacher, author, scholar, administrator, diplomat, and statesman. We all remember him for his inspiring lectures, who had the very unique talent of blending theory and policy, and his writings on trade policy opened at all times new directions, not only for the Caribbean, but for small states in general. No doubt, Sir Alister set his own footprints on Caribbean thought as he grappled with the cycle of prosperity in Caribbean society. In one of our many conversations, Sir Alister would subtly urge me to convert what I am saying to making it happen, which pushed me to the realm of politics and political economy. In retrospect, he may have subtly sowed the seed of a political life in my career path, so much due to the trust that I had and held for his quiet and forceful remarks. Although at that time I used to teach theories of economic growth, it was McIntyre, along with another professor, John Laguerre, who pushed me to do research in income distribution in Trinidad and Tobago, adding a new dimension to my own teaching and my own understanding of Caribbean society in our quest to link growth and equity. I was very privileged to work with Sir Alister while he was Vice Chancellor, and I was then Minister, on the issues of funding specific projects at UWI. I remember his open words at a formal meeting between UWI and the ministry. Minister, you are one of us, which immediately disarmed me if there was indeed a need to do so. This is a down-to-earth diplomacy which saw him succeed, where many would have faltered in these trying times. He was courageous as well in his advocacy for the funding of UWI's capital program with the international bodies, usually well prepared, easy to trust, and with high diplomatic skills. Alister McIntyre walked many hostile paths. I remember specifically Sir Alister's strategic diplomacy when faced with the closure of the regional program of monetary studies. He overcome fierce resistance and territorial nationalism and got it converted into a Caribbean center for Money and Finance, located in Trinidad. It took strategy, but it also took courage. I remember his functioning at the World Trade institutions, always with a winning smile, a thoughtful look, and a captivating confidence. His mastery of the geopolitics at play was evident, but never generated offense. He was par excellence, a supreme diplomat. At times, I will be in the room or in the audience, which provided opportunities to learn from the Grand Master himself. At the heart of his success was a dictum that people matter at the level of those with whom he negotiated and at the level of the citizens whom he ultimately served with humility. Then and now, I felt that he was a teacher. My last meeting with Sir Alister was a courtesy visit I requested. It was at his home in Jamaica. Although having some eye health issues at that time, his mind was sharp. And he asked me about the future of the regional state and the Trinidad and Tobago economy. I sat in his living room and gave him a copy of my book entitled Power, Politics and Performance, which was then recently published, and which is why I had requested the visit as my way to say thanks. He looked at it and quickly captured a sentence from the foreword that was done by P.J. Patterson. The foreword said, "Insistent words by P.J. Patterson." And I quote, as he quoted it, "It is high time that the perception of politics as an obstacle to the advancement of the Caribbean be removed." He spotted it. So like when we first met in that tiny office on the campus in Trinidad, to a very last conversation in the living room of his home in Jamaica, more than 40 years later, we ended our conversation as when we started, in search of a new policy direction for our region. Indeed, the mark of a man to his word. In short, a man of great character. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dukaran, for those thoughtful and insightful reflections on Sir Alister. I now invite Sir Edwin to provide his reflections on Sir Alister.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I am extremely happy to have been invited to this. Seems to be a technological issue here.
But we're hearing you.
Okay,
go ahead.
well, I'll continue. And I'll address my salutations, not necessarily those who are here, but those who I expected or thought might have been here. Starting with Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, the Vice Chancellor of the University of known, I think, who have known me over the years. Professor Rosemary Bellantwine, Vice Chancellor and Principal of St. Augustine. And if I get some of these attributions as to your present positions, do forgive me. I'm not up to date on some of your movements and changes. Professor Denzel Williams, Pro-Vice Chancellor, Principal, UE Five Islands Campus. Professor Winston Ducaran, Professor of Practice, UWI St. Augustine, and my former boss at the Foreign Ministry of Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Michael Latz, Department of Economics, UWI St. Augustine. Dr. Florence Tarring, practitioner. Professor Compton Bourne, an old colleague or friend, I should say, and I am extremely pleased to be amongst you all, and thank you very much for inviting me. I am indeed not only happy to be here, but I'm honored to be part of this initiative on the selected papers and speeches of Sir Alister McIntyre and work of McIntyre, and to be speaking alongside some of the most important minds of the regions, most brilliant minds of the region. Having been in retirement for many years now, it took me quite a bit of effort with my brain to undertake reflections on Sir Alister. But it was difficult to resist participating because of the relationship which I've had with Sir Alister. Particularly relations I had as a student, as a staff of the CARICOM Secretariat, as a member of the staff even of the African, Caribbean, Pacific Group of States, and I'll explain how that came to be. And indeed, as I practice work of Sir Alister McIntyre. In preparing for this, I realized that one of the documents which I helped to engineer, the Caribbean Affairs Journal, look at pages 38 and not the next 10 pages, you'll see a section they call the West Indian University visited by Sir Alister McIntyre. And it's a measure of the breadth and depth of Sir Alister's work. My earliest recollections of Sir Alister McIntyre was at the Mona University of the West Indies in Jamaica, where, on the basis of a scholarship from the government of Trinidad, as a young man, I went to Jamaica to study for a bachelor's degree in economics. And Sir Alister was a lecturer there. What I recall best was his nurturing of us, his students. It was as if we were his children, and he took a personal interest in each and every one of us succeeding. To me, a most important point which impacted on me and every aspect of my life thereafter. Sir Alister advised me, where he was then Alister, not to pursue studies in economics and administration, but instead to pursue the study of economic development. As a young man, as a young student, I took his advice, and it laid the solid foundation for my successful higher education and my professional life. I also recall his great influence on the granting of graduate scholarships, students at the University of the West Indies. An old friend of mine, Charlie Skeet, a fellow student from Barbados, one of their leading economists and diplomats, joined me as part of the group where we were going to approach the university for scholarship for the students who complete their first. And Charlie gave me a statement which I will never forget. He says, if we are good enough to be given scholarships to, by, and or from other universities, we are good enough to be given scholarships by the UN. Well, we were told by the professor at the time that scholarships were not given to us because no one had asked. So we asked, and some students were given scholarships. Much of the arrangement for us to get scholarships cleverly crafted and facilitated by Alister McIntyre. This, ladies and gentlemen, was my initial contact with Alister McIntyre, and it was a significant milestone in my personal, academic, subsequently professional life. Ladies and gentlemen, that was just a small part of the legacy Sir Alister left at UWI, left in the lives of many of us, wider landscape of the region. I am happy to hear the views that I've heard already this morning of the breadth and depth of his contribution. His contribution to regional education has benefited past, present, and will benefit future generations. And his contribution to governance and management of education, its relevance must never be forgotten. So Alister, not surprisingly, was also a leader in the region's economic integration initiatives. He served after the legendary William Dimas as they forged the fledgling Caribbean community, Dimas as Secretary General and Alister. Alister succeeded Dimas as Secretary General when Dimas replaced another Caribbean giant, Sir Lewis, President of the Caribbean Development Bank. How fortunate and gifted the region has to have such a team as spearheads of leading regional institutes in the formative years of the Caribbean community. Sir Alister was also a member of the team of eminent Caribbean citizens, including Dimas and Sir Shridath Ramphal as the chairman, who were appointed by CARICOM heads of government in 1990 to examine the state of regional integration. The ensuing report, you'll recall, named A Time for Action, began a process of regional introspection that resulted in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which established inter alia the CARICOM single market and economy. So Alister was also very instrumental in ensuring that the heads of government of CARICOM recognized the pivotal role played by the University of the West Indies in human resource development of the region and making the University of the West Indies an associate institution of the Caribbean community. He was also influential in my professional life. I am convinced that Sir Alister played a decisive role in my being Dimas's first choice for my first job at the Carifta Secretariat as Chief of Economics and Statistics. Point was, Dimas and McIntyre were good friends. And Dimas indicated to McIntyre that he was looking for a Chief of Economics and Statistics, and that he was looking at the possibility in between me, Carrington, and a gentleman from another country. Alister said to him, you have a chance of getting carried and you thinking of so-and-so, whose name I wouldn't recall. Subsequently, Gimas called and said, I'm not looking at anybody else, just you, just the job. He was acting pushed by Alister. I had a very enjoyable and productive working relationship with Alister Mackin while we were both at the Secretariat during the years 1974 to 76. I recall that in 1976, while I was still at the Secretariat, I was contacted by the Honorable P.J. Patterson, former Prime Minister of Jamaica, on behalf of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Group of States. P.J. Patterson approached me to inquire if I would accept an offer to be the Deputy Secretary General of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Group. At that time, Sir Alister was my boss, and I needed his approval to accept the offer. I was going to do so. I will forever remember Alister's famous statement to me when I told him, look, well, I've gotten this request from P.J. Patterson that the African, Caribbean, Pacific Group of Ministers would like me to assume this group because they have seen me how I worked with P.J. Patterson in his group of the European Union sugar price negotiation. Alister said to me, Carrie, I will be happy if you go, and I will be happy if you stay. These are the words I can never forget. Because when he first said, I will be happy if you go, I thought, oh, he doesn't want me to stay. He said, I'll be happy if you go, and I'll be happy if you stay. Alister was looking at the ACP, and he was looking at the Caribbean. I took up the ACP offer in Brussels, and some years later became Secretary General of the ACP group. The rest, ladies and gentlemen, is history. I will therefore forever remember Sir Alister as a man committed not only to regional development, but one who had the development of the Caribbean region and indeed the wider ACP region close to his. So on, ladies and gentlemen, was more deserving. No one was more deserving of the numerous honors Sir Alister has received, including several honorary degrees, the Order of the Caribbean Community, the region's highest honor, the Order of Merit from the Government of Jamaica, the Cassie Crown of Honor from the Government of Guyana, and indeed, knighted from the United Kingdom. Sir Alister was really a shining Caribbean star who was well known internationally, regionally, as well at universities and international levels. Today's initiative, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the launching of the selected papers and speeches of Alister at the time, would further pursue that work, the memory and the legacy of this son of Grenada, that it remains part of the Caribbean's development landscape forever. In all that he did, so Alister always wanted from the university, from the Caribbean region, and a better world. I therefore thank the university for this initiative, particularly Vice Chancellor Sir Hilary Beckles for his outstanding leadership of the institution. In conclusion, please allow me the opportunity to express my condolences to the family of Dr. Richard Bernal, who I knew quite well on his own time. He too was an outstanding CARICOM citizen. I thank you all, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Sir Edwin, for essentially contextualizing for all of us those very personal interventions. So we knew Sir Alister as the giant that he was in terms of his deep commitment to regional integration and development of the Caribbean region, but also those personal touches. Both you and Mr. Dukaran essentially personalized him, those touches. Mr. Dukaran spoke about, his quiet diplomacy, the way in which he engaged. You spoke about him essentially mentoring you in terms of your career trajectory and your profession. So thank you both for sharing those reflections with us this evening and essentially giving us a deeper appreciation and understanding of Sir Alister. I have to do a little bit of work for the UWI Press in terms of the promotion. We want to encourage persons to purchase copies of the publications, Caribbean Trade, Integration and Development, Selected Papers and Speeches of Sir Alister McIntyre, Volumes 1 and 2. And there is a 50% discount available if you order via the UWI Press. That discount is valid until January 31st. And there is a code. I know before we finish this evening's virtual book launch, they will put it up, but I will just read it out. There is a code 03 UWIP, as in UWI Press 23. At checkout, and you get a 50% discount. There's some other conditions that apply, but we want to encourage you to spread the word in terms of the promotion that the UWI Press is running to encourage persons to purchase copies of the selected papers and speeches that we're launching this evening. Joining us this evening to provide a review of the volumes is Dr. Terence Farrell, who is both an economist and an attorney at law. He's a former central bank deputy governor. He has worked for regional companies in information technology, insurance, and media. He's a certified mediator and also a fellow of the Institute of Banking and Finance in Trinidad and Tobago. He's a member of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators in the UK, and he's also a member of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. He's a director of Republic Financial Holdings, as well as several private companies. He has provided national service on a number of government-appointed committees addressing various public policy issues, including most recently the Economic Development Advisory Board and the National Tripartite Advisory Council. Over the last 10 years, Dr. Farrell has contributed over 100 opinion pieces to national and regional newspapers and presented to numerous organizations in the public and private sector. So I wish to invite Dr. Farrell to share with us his review of the volumes.
Thank you very much, Marlene, for that introduction. And I would consider, as we say, all protocols observed in terms of the distinguished speakers that we have here, including my former lecturer, Winston Dukaran. So let me start off by saying that Compton really catch me with this one because he very casually asked me to review the work of Alister McIntyre, which he and Arnold, who I know quite well, Andrew Downs, who I also know quite well, and Rosalie O'Malley had compiled and edited. And of course, I just as casually said, sure. And then the two volumes appeared by email. One was over 400 pages and the other almost 200 pages. And so it is a little bit daunting, quite frankly. And this was just around the Christmas time. So I was trying to figure out how am I going to do this work and get ready for a review in January. When I looked at the volumes, however, I very quickly realized that much of the material in volume 1, which is the larger volume, for almost 400 pages, was very familiar to me. I had read several of them as an undergraduate student in the UWI BSc Economics program. specifically in Lloyd Best's course, which was then called Caribbean Economic Problems, or CEP. And I myself had prescribed those readings when I later taught CEP, and indeed, both in 1974 and in 1979, 1980, when I taught that course. The writings of McIntyre, Best, Girvan, Beckford, Dimas, Levitt, Brewster, C.Y. Thomas were the staple fare of the BSc Economics program in those days. As students, those economists were our icons. They were our intellectual heroes. And it was tremendously exciting when later on, as professionals ourselves, we could meet with these giants and even debate with them. Once I started to peruse the material, another problem emerged. How should I review a book that had already been reviewed? You see, the editors didn't just compile the material in some chronological and subject matter order. They also elected to review and to comment on each section. Now, these excellent commentaries are, I think, extremely useful to the reader who might be navigating this material for the first time. And in some instances, they offer some very interesting and at times very incisive critique of McIntyre's work. So what was I to do? Essentially, I decided that I would treat with the material as a whole and attempt to identify and elucidate the economic thinking of Alister McIntyre and locate that thought in the context of the evolution of Caribbean economic thought. What did the material, so comprehensively assembled by the editors, tell us about McIntyre, the economist? Where in the spectrum from radical to conservative, from theoretical to pragmatic, should he be located? Was he, in Girvan's taxonomy, a dependency theorist or a structuralist institutionalist? Now, before attempting to locate McIntyre in this way, I think it would be useful to identify and to discuss the themes or ideas which run more or less consistently through his body of work. I've identified 5 such themes. First, competitiveness. Second, import substitution, regional integration, and industrial programming. Third, discipline, hard work, and high achievement. Fourth, knowledge, education, and human capital development. And fifth, redistribution and social justice. So let me start with competitiveness. From his earliest writings, McIntyre grappled with the competitiveness of West Indian exports and reconciling that with the pursuit of what Best had described as imperial preference. In these early writings, competitiveness was understood to mean price competitiveness. While McIntyre noted that one argument for preference for West Indian traditional exports, such as sugar, cocoa, bananas, arrowroot, was because Britain owed preferential treatment to its former colonies, he acknowledged that the West Indian islands were being outcompeted in foreign markets, and that these geopolitical forces, especially Britain's accession to the European common market, were clearly spelling the end of imperial preference. The West Indies had to find ways to become competitive or to see the demise of these traditional export industries. Moreover, the continuation of preferences was seen to be an obstacle to cooperation among developing countries themselves. Later on in his writings, you'll see that McIntyre came to the modern view of competitiveness, informed, I think, mostly by business, that competitiveness was not just something mainly, it was just about price, but it was a vector of attributes, including the quality of the product or service, convenience, durability, underpinned by marketing, branding, and standards. He wrote, and I quote, "One of the present realities of the global economy is that international competitiveness is less dependent on price. It is more reliant on the quality, innovativeness of the product and the sales and after-sales services delivered with it. Aggressive marketing involves regular updating of product lines with a view to attracting new customers, concentrating on responding to their rapidly changing tastes. These have all been features of the export success in the fast-growing economies in South and Southeast Asia. They explain why some countries in Asia, notably China and India, are fast becoming major global economies. Let me turn now to the second theme, regional integration, import substitution, and industrial programming. The problem for economists like McIntyre, Demas, and Best in the 1950s and early 1960s was that first, they repudiated classical, neoclassical, and Keynesian economic theory. And second, they also repudiated Lewis's policy recommendations for growing manufacturers for export using foreign investors. Reflecting on the small size of the regional economies, McIntyre and Demas embraced fully the notion that regional integration was foundational to Caribbean economic development. Best, while sharing a belief in regional integration, was himself not persuaded that small size was the constraint that the integrationists made it out to be. Moreover, the integrationists had to accept that governments would have the role of prime mover in the process of economic growth and development. Best, however, perceived that regional integration implied giving up some amount of sovereignty, and that the Federation having collapsed, the politics of regional integration could be a problem. McIntyre and Demas could see no alternative to regional integration, which was to be implemented through regional import substitution and industrial programming. McIntyre followed Demas into the leadership of the CARICOM Secretariat, as Edwin has just explained. While he later acknowledged that regional industrial programming had never got off the ground, McIntyre continued to hold on to his belief in import substitution, asserting, and I quote, "As far as import substitution versus export development debate is concerned, experience has shown that the dichotomy tends to be false. Countries need to do both." The third theme is discipline, hard work, and high achievement. McIntyre consistently advocated for a hardworking, disciplined, high-achieving Caribbean society. He lamented low productivity across large sections of the labor force. He noted that competitiveness required high productivity. In this regard, McIntyre was at one with Lloyd Best, who famously and consistently advocated what he called power to the hard work, and Arthur Lewis, whom McIntyre himself quotes as saying, and this is a quote of Lewis, I quote, "You must be willing to work hard while the rest of your companions are at play. You must be willing to practice over and over again until you get it right. You must be highly self-critical. You must be humble enough to welcome, analyze, and apply the criticisms of others, or you will never learn. There is no doubt that achievers have a special type of personality. This drive for achievement is not identical with brain power. Many people with excellent brains achieve nothing, while men with moderate brains can be highly successful if they have the drive to achieve." End of quote. That's a quote from Lewis. McIntyre adverted to what is today described as cultural confidence. He noted that, and I quote him now, "Integration is, after all, part of a development strategy based on self-reliance, which assumes a degree of self-confidence that does not come easily to a people brought up and nurtured in colonialism. We have to work hard to conquer our insecurities if we are going to succeed in deepening the process of integration," end quote. Today, Mia Motley, of course, is the champion of the need for cultural confidence on the part of West Indians. The fourth, knowledge, education, and human capital development. The importance of education and knowledge, not surprisingly, does not feature significantly in McIntyre's early writings in the 1960s and 1970s. At that time, while development economists acknowledged the importance of education to development, in fact, Lewis devoted a whole chapter in his theory of economic growth to knowledge, it did not have the prominence and emphasis which later writers gave to it, once econometric methods allow for its impact to be measured and assessed. But by the time of the delivery of the Eric Williams Memorial Lecture in 1988, McIntyre was able to assert, and I quote, "Future growth will greatly depend on whether we can successfully make the transition from a pattern of development principally dependent on natural resources to one dependent on human resources and knowledge. This will require a major strengthening of our capacity to acquire, adapt, develop, and utilize technology. We have to look increasingly towards science, technology, management, and organization as key ingredients of the development process, end of quote. McIntyre here was not only pointing out the importance of education, but pointing to the ingredients necessary for the development of what later came to be described as the knowledge economy, where knowledge is seen not only as an inchoate input into the production process, but as outputs taking the form of educational tourism, online courses, and so on. In his 2006 speech on the knowledge economy, McIntyre links knowledge to innovation and then back to competitiveness. And finally, the fifth theme, social justice and redistribution. McIntyre's advocacy of social justice and income and wealth redistribution is more muted than the other themes I've identified. But there was little doubt that he was concerned about lifting Caribbean people out of poverty, and that economic development had an inescapable social justice component to it. His concern for social justice even led McIntyre to advocate direct instruments of control to effect changing the pattern of demand so as to allow for the attainment of scale economies on the production side, while at the same time suggesting that the price mechanism was, as he put it, in conflict with meaningful structural change. He argued in defense of such policies that, and I quote, "hard choices are required in the Caribbean if we are to provide a satisfactory stake in the economy for our less fortunate brothers and sisters." So with those 5 themes, let me now turn to locating McIntyre. McIntyre was well known to the first generation of economists to graduate from the UWI. Since his early writings grappled with what were then the key issues of trade in traditional exports, the trade and preference regimes under which these were sold, and the implications for trade and trading relationships for development and transformation. That said, McIntyre was not a theoretical economist. He used the available data to address the questions around trade. He was a development economist who described himself as unorthodox in order to distinguish himself from orthodox, neoclassical, or classical economics. He was pragmatic and policy-oriented. He asked himself, what could the region's policymakers do in respect of trade and trade policy to foster development? In his academic career at Mona, St. Augustine, and ISER at Mona, McIntyre produced 4 important pieces of work, all empirical: aspects of development and trade, decolonization and trade policy, the political economy of Canadian West Indian relations with Carrie Levitt, and studies in foreign investment with Beverly Watson. His reflections on the problem of unemployment in 1973 is also noteworthy, because in that piece, he critiques Dudley Sayers and Arthur Lewis, albeit in his typically cautious language. McIntyre's theoretical frameworks are in fact hard to discern, given that his penchant for obliqueness. But on my reading, these are not inconsistent with traditional classical and neoclassical theories. He saw the need for efficiency, but seemed to shrink away from some of its implications. But McIntyre was more importantly a builder of institutions. From his autobiography, The Caribbean in the Wider World, we know that during the period he functioned as an academic, he helped build the BSc Economics honors program at both Mona and at St. Augustine, worked on the establishment of the Institute of International Relations located at St. Augustine, and gave policy advice to the governments of Jamaica and Trinidad. And as Winston has pointed out, he was also found instrumental in the formation of the Caribbean Center for Money and Finance. He did generate some very interesting theoretical insights, if we may call it that. For example, in Decolonization and Trade Policy, a paper which from his autobiography apparently he wrote overnight, he made the distinction between structural dependence and functional dependence, noting in respect to the latter that it influenced choices made by policymakers. and that the pursuit of imperial preference reflected that functional dependence. This was a promising line of inquiry, which, however, MacIntyre never pursued. Had he done so, it may well have taken him closer to the trajectory of thinking of Lloyd Best in his Independent Thought and Caribbean Freedom, and Best's skepticism that regional policymakers were up to the task of development in the post-colonial Caribbean. Instead, MacIntyre, following Dimas, would evolve into a regional and then an international technocrat, fully aware of the foibles of the politicians with which he worked, but constrained to be dutiful, deferential, and diplomatic. Govan, in his 1973 piece, locates MacIntyre in the structural dependency school alongside Dimas, and saw Dimas's Economics of Development in Small Countries, written in 1965, as the theoretical fruition of that trend of Caribbean economic thought. Govan differentiates the Best MacIntyre line of thought from the historical, structural, institutional approach of Best, Levitt, and Beckford. The common ground is the repudiation of neoclassical and classical economics. Of all his contemporaries, however, MacIntyre, probably because as an academic economist he dealt entirely with international trade and investment, distinguished himself by his emphasis on the importance of competitiveness. This is found nowhere else, not even in the work of Dimas, MacIntyre's intellectual twin, as he was described by Sonny Ramphal. So in terms of my assessment, MacIntyre's body of work is of less interest to the economists seeking theoretical insight into the workings of Caribbean economies. It is of great value, however, to the analysts seeking insight into development policy and specifically trade policy, and those seeking insights into the complexities of trade negotiations. Secondly, MacIntyre never gives up on regional integration, though he does give up eventually and reluctantly on regional industrial programming. Third, MacIntyre was prescient and forward-thinking. He saw the writing on the wall in respect of imperial preference and urged the region's policymakers to embrace regional integration and import substitution as the way forward. He came to terms very quickly with the computer revolution of the 1970s and 1980s and strove to understand the impact it would have for productivity and, of course, for production, trade, and trade policy. He grasped this critical importance of knowledge as both a factor of production as well as a product itself. The UWI was therefore a key instrument, in his view, in the economic development of the Caribbean. Fourth, circumspect language is what is expected of technocrats and civil servants, and MacIntyre was always careful and cautious in his use of language. He was diplomatic, politically correct, and deferential to the politicians. Even as an academic, his analysis is usually preliminary, and his conclusions are always provisional and tentative. This approach is probably key to his success as a trade negotiator for the region. Fifth, MacIntyre believed in government as the main actor in the process of Caribbean development. His work largely ignored the private sector and gave little agency to private sector actors other than the multinational corporations. It is only later in his capacity as Vice Chancellor that he really recognizes and engages with the local private sector as a partner in the development process. Yet, although he hints at the fact that the political leadership in the region was problematic, he is never critical or condemnatory. He does not ask, as the editors of the volumes do, and I quote, why, with the technical excellence of Sir Alister MacIntyre on hand and the generation of economists he guided, has West Indian political leadership failed to fulfill its dreams and promises of true West Indian unity, end of quote. So in conclusion, I've tried to locate MacIntyre in the whole sweep of the evolution of Caribbean economic thought. He was very much located, I would say, within the structural dependency school. So I'm agreeing with Govan in that regard, influenced significantly by his intellectual twin, Willie Dimas. And it seems to me that post that period, post that 1970s, the 1980s and so on, that Caribbean economic theorizing seems to have sort of almost ground to a halt, and that many of the succeeding generations of economists have sort of gone back to metropolitan theorizing. And we have to come, I think this volume is going to be extremely important for our practicing economists as well as for our students, because I think we need to rediscover the importance of indigenous Caribbean thinking, indigenous Caribbean economic theorizing about how our economies actually work, and in particular, how our governments influence the trajectories of our economies. So these two volumes of the selected academic papers and speeches of Alister McIntyre, I think one of our region's finest sons, is, I think, an invaluable addition to the Caribbean economic literature. And I commend the editors, Compton, Arnold, Rosalie, and Andrew, and the UW Press for giving us this tremendous volume, those tremendous volumes. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Terry. And of course, I'm going to go into Terry mode now, because after such an excellent review, couple of things I have to tell you that we still have, it's no longer called Caribbean Economic Problems, it's called Caribbean Economy. And I inherited that responsibility for that course. So I'm now the new generation of lecturer for that course since 2009. I had a small stint away from the department, and it's interesting that you mentioned the whole concept of the metropolitan theorizing, and I think it's important. What your review reminded me is that it's important for us to reflect on our economic history in the region, because some of the errors that we're seeing made now, currently, I think it's because there's an absence or lack of understanding of our Caribbean economic history and the nuances of how Caribbean economies work and how they function. So I thank you for that review, and I again thank the editors for putting these two volumes together so that all students of economics, it is a bit of a tragedy that I understand that Caribbean economy is no longer a compulsory course for all students, but I will try to see how best we can reverse that decision. And certainly students will have the opportunity to benefit from the scholarship and the work of Sir Alister and others like him. I think that's one of the things that I'm committed to doing now that I have resumed residency in the department. So thanks again, Terry, for that very detailed review of the two volumes. I now wish to invite the librarians. We have 3 librarians with us. I now invite the following librarians to receive complimentary copies of the 2 volumes, Caribbean Trade, Integration and Development, Selected Papers and Speeches of Sir Alister McIntyre. First, I'd like to invite the Executive Director of the National Library and Information System Authority, Ms. Paula Green, to receive her complimentary copy. And we're seeing a picture of Nallis.
Can you see me now?
Yes, we're seeing you now. Welcome. And yes, you have your complimentary copies. Yes. All right. Thank you. Then we invite the Miss Alison Dolland, the Deputy Campus Librarian from the Alma Jordan Library of the UWI St. Augustine campus. Miss Dolland.
Thank you.
Yes.
Happy to receive the copies on behalf of the Alma Jordan Library.
And we'll ensure that our students make good use of it at St. Augustine campus. Thank you, Ms. Dolland. And last but no means least, Ms. Unica Omowale, the librarian from the Norman Girvan Library at the Institute of International Relations, also at the UWI St. Augustine campus. Mrs. Omowale.
Thank you on behalf of Norman Girvan Library.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much. So again, I want to take the opportunity to remind about the book promotion. So there is a promotion that allows us to enjoy a 50% discount if you order copies via the UWI Press, www.uwipress.com. And the promotion runs until January 31st. You enter the code 03UWIP23 at checkout. Certain conditions apply, but the opportunity to enjoy a special 50% discount if you purchase copies of the volumes, and this runs until January 31st. As we wind down this evening's virtual launch, I wish to invite one of the editors, Professor Compton Bourne, to give closing remarks at this time. Professor Bourne, as we have heard, is the former president of the Caribbean Development Bank. He's also former Pro-Vice Chancellor and campus principal of the UWI St. Augustine campus. And he's also Professor Emeritus of Economics at UWI St. Augustine. Professor Bourne, I invite you to take the floor.
Trying to get my video started. Yes, it should start now.
There you are. We're seeing you.
Yes, right. Fine. Well, all protocols observed in the interest of time. Let me say that this launch of Caribbean trade, integration, and development has proceeded pleasingly well. I therefore begin my vote of thanks on behalf of the editors, Professor Emeritus Andrew Downs, Dr. Meredith Arnold McIntyre, Ms. Rosalie O'Mealy, and myself, and on behalf of colleagues at the University Press, by acknowledging the excellent chairing of the proceedings by Dr. Marlene Atz, and thank her not only for doing so with aplomb, but also for her opening remarks, which set us on the right track. Dr. Atz might well recall that several years ago, she chaired the St. Augustine launch of Sir Alister's memoirs, The Caribbean and the Wider World. Professor Rosemary Bell-Antoine, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal of the St. Augustine campus, despite an obviously hectic schedule over the last few days, which included her induction ceremony and the annual UWI St. Augustine Carnival Fete, graciously agreed to make welcoming remarks to the participants in this launch and to, in fact, provide her own statements about the importance of Sir Alister McIntyre to the development of thought and policy in the Caribbean and for the benefit of all Caribbean people. Professor Antoine, we are very grateful for the remarks you have made on this occasion. Now, we have heard that Hillary be with us could not, for unavoidable reasons, has always supported this publication and the functions such as this book launch, which seek to introduce the work to a wider readership across the Caribbean. I want to give Sir Hilary notice that you will call upon him for a launch in Guyana, which the Secretary General of CARICOM, Secretary General of the Caribbean Community, has kindly agreed to sponsor sometime later in this year. Professor Denzel Williams, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal of the UWI Five Islands campus, not only graciously agreed to make remarks at this book launch, but did so at the previous launches in Jamaica and in Barbados. Very importantly, as chairman of the UWI Press, he ensured the publication process was completed efficiently and on a timely basis. We sincerely thank Professor Williams for his support and for his efforts on our behalf. For you, Professor Williams, Guyana also beckons. We have had two insightful, informative, and engaging reflections on the late Sir Alister McIntyre by persons who have worked with him, knew him particularly well, and hold him in high regard. Professor Winston Ducaran, Professor of Practice at UW St. Augustine, and Sir Edwin Carrington, distinguished former Secretary General of the Caribbean Community and the ACP Group of States, readily accepted my invitation to participate in this book launch and thereby not only contribute to the quality of the occasion, but also share the reflections with a wider audience. We, from their remarks, have learned their reflections, have learned a lot more about how Sir Alister McIntyre not only is regarded, but how he has impacted their own professional careers and, by implication, the careers of those that they have interacted with over the years. Thank you very much, Professor Ducaran and Sir Edwin Carrington. It is a formidable task to review 2 volumes extending over 517 pages of complex, often technical material on the wide range of topics in the field of international trade, international and regional finance, international development assistance, international negotiations, regional economic integration, human resource development, higher education, and the University of the West Indies. We, the editors, could think of no person other than our esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Terence Farrell, with the requisite breadth of knowledge, articulateness, perseverance, and stamina. All participants in this book launch are surely in agreement that our confidence was not misplaced. Dr. Farrell gave us, we are forever in your debt for a wonderful, thoughtful, and insightful review of the volumes and for enabling a better understanding of Sir Alister McIntyre's work. Not least, I wish to thank those institutions and their key personnel who, by their financial contributions, made the publication possible. Specifically, the Anson McCall Foundation, the Caribbean Development Bank, and the International Development Research Center of Canada. Finally, I thank all those who joined us virtually this evening for the launch of the Alister McIntyre volumes. Thank you all very much. Esteemed Chairperson, I now return the stage to you.
Thank you, Professor Bourne. Thank you for those closing remarks. My final act this evening is to thank everyone for spending time with us and for, essentially engaging in a discourse on Caribbean economy, led by, of course, the speeches and papers and the writings of Sir Alister. I think we are forever indebted again to the editors for the commitment that they made in producing these volumes. Thanking also the UWI Press, the entire team, thanking the marketing team at the UWI Press that put this together and kept us in check. And again, my final word is to remember to take advantage of the promotion to get the copies of the 2 volumes and the 50% discount. So again, I'd like to close off this evening's virtual launch by thanking you all for your participation. Thank you all for your words of encouragement. A special thanks to Professor Bell and Professor Antwine. Sorry, it's been an extremely busy period for her, but she found time to spend with us this evening. Thank PVC Williams, Professor Denzel Williams, for spending time with us in Trinidad and possibly also managing his campus virtually while he's in Trinidad to participate, to ensure that he was able to participate in this event. Thank Dr. Farrell again for his very thorough review of the 2 volumes, and thank the librarians for receiving copies of the volumes so that they can ensure that they're part of their collection for future generations of economists. That is what Sir Alister would have wanted, and we're going to ensure that the teachings and writings that speak to the nuances of the Caribbean economy, we're going to ensure that our young economists, our young scholars at our universities, they are in fact exposed to these teachings so that their experience is not only one that looks at a metropolitan theory, but one that is deeply grounded in Caribbean economic realities and therefore be able to shape and influence public policy. So with those few words, I wish everyone a good evening and thank you again for your attention. And have a good night, everyone.